Father, I thank you for the day, and again, Lord, I thank you for your word. I pray that you would allow it to move us. I pray that you would burn your word into our hearts and our minds. And Father, help us to receive and respond appropriately at all times when we hear from you. And I pray that we would indeed hear from you. We thank you, we love you, and it's in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so by show of hands, how many of you want to go to court? How many of you want to get one of those notices that said you're being sued and you need to show up in court? Anybody? Not a single person. Okay. Then let me ask you this question. Why do we hear so many stories about companies, by the way, this is not political, why do we hear so many stories about companies settling outside of court? Even if the person that's suing is clearly just doing it for money, oftentimes we hear stories about them settling out of court. Why? To protect their image, and frankly, it's cheaper in many cases to give someone $50,000, $100,000, whatever, to make them go away, especially if you're talking about a big company, because with big companies typically come big-time lawyers, which means big-time bills, not to mention the distraction of having to deal with court. So this is not new, by the way. This situation that America is in with all of the law, and as long as I've been alive, we've been talking about it being a litigious society because of how much people sue and get sued and all of that. This is not new. In fact, this was very common in the Roman era during the time the New Testament was written. And it existed before that, but my understanding of history, I could be wrong on this, my understanding of history is that's when a lot of what we would recognize as a litigious society started. Or when it became apparent. Maybe that's the better way to word it. Not that there weren't lawsuits and laws and all of that before that, but this was something that was common in Roman society. In fact, in Roman society, I think you could argue it was worse than it is here, because according to historians, sometimes, just like they had the gladiators that would fight to the death for entertainment, sometimes they would take each other to court just for entertainment. Well, no. I guess we do that too. Anybody heard of People's Court? So it's not a new problem. And Jesus, in his teaching that's recorded by Matthew here in chapter 5, he's playing off of this. And so what I want to do is I want to give you a picture of where we're going. Last week we talked about Matthew 18, and we generally call that the church discipline passage, but really it's about reconciliation and forgiveness. But Matthew 18 is focusing on you have been offended, or how do you deal with an offense in terms of the process. Matthew 5 is actually introducing, I would argue, two things to that argument. The first is, if you can settle before it gets that far, it's far better for you. And the second, last week we talked about what happens when you have been offended. You're offended, it's your responsibility to go and talk to that person. That's, in a nutshell, one of the main points from last week. This week, one of the main nutshells is, if you know somebody is offended at you, and what I want you to notice as we read is the absence of whether that person is right or wrong in their offense. The encouragement, the command and exhortation from Scripture is, if I know that somebody else is offended, it's my job to approach them. That's in this passage. Last week was, if I messed up, I need to approach whoever and make apologies, make things right. So here's the deal. No matter what, whether you are the offender or the offendee, what is your job? To try and reconcile. Period. There's no excuse. If you have been offended, then go to them. If you know someone's bothered by you, then go to them. Of course, in love, all the qualifiers that we gave last week. So I just want you to know kind of the big picture where we're going today as we get into this. Now, I want you to pay attention. Matthew put these sections together. So in the beginning of chapter 5, we have the Beatitudes. These are the basics of the faith. This is like the Proverbs of Matthew. It's a bunch of short sayings where Jesus was teaching people, here's a good way to honor God. Here's a way to honor God. And then we have a discussion about being the salt of the earth. So here's how you act. Then the salt of the earth section, here's how your actions affect the world. Then we have the section on the light of the world. It's the same thing there. Let your light so shine behind or before men. Then in verse 17, he's saying, look, I didn't come to get rid of the Old Testament. I didn't come to get rid of laws, because some people accused Jesus of that. When he got to the heart of the matter, they accused him, well, see, you just don't want us following the law. You just want to do away with everything. He's like, no. I'm not lightening the load. I'm pointing you where it's supposed to be. But they fundamentally misunderstood that, and the same happens today. So I don't think that it's an accident that God in his sovereignty directed Matthew to put these things together. So we start in verse 21. My Bible has the heading personal relationships. Remember, those headings are not inspired. The actual text is. Jesus teaching, he says, you have heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. Well, that's kind of one of the big 10, right? You have heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. Now, the court part was not the 10 Commandments. That was something that came later, but it would make sense that you would have a court system. So he's not arguing the existence of either of those two things. One is actually in the 10 Commandments. But I say to you, so Jesus teaches with authority, and he wants them to understand it, not just memorize it. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. What court? The court where you're being charged with murder that he just referred to. He's saying if you're angry with your brother, you're guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. So he's ratcheting this up. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now, as I often say, I'm sure you're more sanctified than I am, but I've been guilty of all three of those at different points in my life. I'm without excuse. I deserve hell. And Jesus is making it very clear here. This isn't just the warm, fuzzy Jesus that everybody wants to believe in. Jesus taught more than just God is love. He also taught that there's a standard that we're going to be measured by. And if we don't meet that standard, we don't get to go to heaven. And we have to understand that in order to be able to accept the salvation that Jesus offered, because he paid that price. Therefore, so 23 and the next couple of verses is the main point of what we're getting to today. But I wanted us to have that background. Remember, but by the way, before I'm not teaching on these two verses in particular, but why does Jesus equate anger with murder?
Because anger leads to murder.
Okay, we'll play with that. Joshua said, because anger leads to murder. Well, thankfully not always. But emotionally, when we're angry with someone, we want to punish them. What is the end result of capital punishment? Death. There is a connection between anger and wanting someone dead, even if we don't realize it. Because we want to throw the book at them. You offended me, I'm throwing the book at you. We talked about that last week. I'm not teaching on these two passages, on these two scriptures, but don't miss that. Based on all of this, verse 23, as you've probably heard preachers say before, therefore is there for a reason. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering on the altar, therefore what? What came before it that's so important that Jesus is tying these two sections together? He's talking about anger and the moral superior sense of judgment. Remember, there's two types of judgment. We talked about that last week. The Corinthians passage says a spiritual man judges in all things. That is the sense of having discernment, the ability to see right and wrong and be able to say, hey, brother, I love you, but what you're doing is not good here. That's discernment, not being judgmental. Being judgmental is thinking yourself morally superior and putting others down. So he's talking about that. He's talking about anger. In other words, when we offend each other, as we read last week, offenses will come. When we offend each other is essentially this section. So verse 23, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar. Now, we have a table we call an altar, but it's not an actual altar. We don't bring animals in here and sacrifice them and do all the stuff in the Old Testament. Sometimes we might call the stage the altar because it's the idea that it's the place that we go to meet God. Well, there's nothing wrong with having a place that is set aside and holy in that sense. But we can't forget that we meet God everywhere. We're always in His presence. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, so in this context, they would have been in a temple with a literal altar. It was the place of worship. So what do you think would be a fair analogy for this today if we're applying this truth? How would we understand the altar? There's a couple of possibilities. One would be when you enter the church, because we're coming to the place that we have dedicated to meet with God as a group. You might argue that it's the moment that you give to the offering. Maybe that is your altar, since we're using this in the non-literal sense. Maybe it's your prayer time, because that's where you meet with God. And in that moment, the place at which you stand is holy, because you're meeting with God there. I think there's a number of ways that we can apply this. In context, it would have been talking about a literal altar at the temple during weekly worship as well as annual festivals, and there were a bunch of them. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you. So in other words, you're coming to meet with God, you are getting ready to worship God, and all of a sudden you remember that somebody's upset with you, that your brother has something against you, is the text. Now, I'll ask a couple of more rhetorical questions. Why do you think that it pops into this theoretical person's mind, or our mind, since Jesus is talking to us through this passage? Why do you think that that's the moment that it comes to mind? I'll propose a couple of possibilities. I would argue that the Holy Spirit is active and at work. It doesn't say that here, but it says it in plenty of other passages. I would argue that the Holy Spirit is saying, hey, you're here to worship God, right? You're supposed to have a clean heart when you approach God. You don't have a clean heart because there's something going on here. I would also argue that if you have good spiritual discipline, that when you come to church or your prayer time, your goal is to say, God, I'm laid out before you. There's nothing hidden. There's no secret closets that you're not allowed in. I'm the same person in private when I'm aware of you as I am the person when I'm not aware of you, as I am the person in public. God, help me to be so, right? Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. It's a prayer and a request and an acknowledgement all at the same time. I would think that as you develop your spiritual disciplines, you just get in the habit of saying, oh, if I'm going to proclaim God, I need to make sure that I'm doing as much as I can to bless the Lord. Well, what is the greatest commandment? This one's not rhetorical.
Love the Lord with all your heart, and the second like it, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. Elsewhere, the Bible says that we can't really worship a God that we can't see if we don't love the people that we can see. So there is a connection between our relationship with others and our relationship with God. And there's a parable about that too, about a steward who was forgiven a massive debt. And then he finds someone that owes them the equivalent of lunch money. I've preached on this passage, I think, twice since I've been here. Owes them the equivalent of lunch money and wants to go after that person for the equivalent of lunch money, not realizing I've just been forgiven all this debt. And when the guy that forgave him found out, he's like, Aaron paraphrase, "You fool. I forgave you all of that and you couldn't forgive him that change?" It ended up worse for the guy in that parable than before. Another passage. Wrong one. Romans 12:18. This is one of my favorite passages for a lot of things, but in particular when we're talking about reconciliation. Inasmuch as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. Inasmuch as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. Romans 12:18. I think that summarizes these two messages in one verse. Last week, if you have been offended, if you are the offender, this week, if someone else is offended at you. But let me also point out verse 23. Let's read that one again. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you. Now, look at the next verse or two. Does it say if they're right? Does it say if you're there at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you and it was true that you messed up? Is that what that says? No. It says if your brother has something against you, what's the very next verse? Leave your offering before the altar. Not on the altar, leave it before the altar. In other words, you don't even get to worship until you make this right. Literal, bring an animal in to sacrifice it. Oh, I just remembered somebody's mad at me. I need to go make this right. Leave the lamb, the turtle doves, the casserole. Yes, the Old Testament, you would sacrifice casseroles occasionally. Leave it there. Go make it right. My paraphrase. Let's read the verse. Leave your offering there before the altar and go. That is an imperative. It means you now. Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Turn really quickly to Psalm 51. It's another one of my favorite passages. Psalm 51, and you'll have to give me just a moment to find the verse, because I wasn't planning to go here. Psalm 51, I've taught you guys on this psalm before. Just a quick reminder, this is David after he messed up with Bathsheba. He committed adultery, committed murder, split the kingdom of Israel. He was having a really not good time with the Lord during this time. I'm looking for the section where David actually states that he's going to make things right, my paraphrase, and then he would offer the sacrifice. If somebody finds it, you can shout out the verse, because I'm missing it somehow in here. 16. Thank you. Verse 16. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not you will not despise. By your favor do good to Zion, build the walls of Jerusalem. Verse 19 follows it up. Then you will delight in right sacrifices and burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then young bulls will be offered on your altar. So Jesus, as he explicitly told us, he wasn't teaching a new law. This is something that has existed as long as humanity has existed. When we have trouble with other people, it is our job to make it right now. Let's go back to verse 23 in Matthew 5. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. So the concept here is no matter who did the offense, or no matter who was offended, whether it was a real offense or a perceived offense, our job is unity. Our job is to go toward Christ, and just like that triangle analogy, remember, if two people are walking toward the same point, they have to get closer together. It doesn't work any other way. If one person starts walking away from the central point, then they grow farther apart. What is the body of Christ, the church, supposed to represent? A number of good answers you could give me. In a nutshell, God's kingdom. If the church, not just Reevesville, but the church at large, if the church can't get along with each other, how do we preach a gospel of hope and freedom? Think about over the years all the scandals and the public issues in churches. I remember a pastor that was serving in a church when I was young. He's apparently still pastoring. But when I was younger, in middle school, he was pastoring. He left the church that we were in. I really liked him. He left, and within a week of being at his new church, the youth minister was arrested for doing things with underage people. He got there just in time for it to blow up. And it made the news everywhere, understandably. If God's people can't demonstrate God's kingdom, what hope are we preaching? Jesus said that we would be known, or he would be known by our love. And then verse 25, we're going to read down to verse 26. My opening statement to you about settling things out of court. Verse 25, make friends quickly with your opponent at law. What opponent? He just talked about problems, right? You're offended, your brother's offended, there are offenses. What court is he talking about? Go back to verse 21. God's court. He's using the earthly court system as an analogy, but he's talking about the court of God. In other words, the only ultimate judge. See, sometimes we overemphasize God's wrath and judgment and justice, and sometimes we overemphasize his mercy and his grace. The truth is, he is perfectly wrathful and perfectly just and perfectly merciful and perfectly gracious. But he wouldn't be God if sin wasn't dealt with. That's why an infinite payment in the form of Jesus was necessary for our salvation. Verse 25, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way. In other words, you've been called to court. You happen to meet on the street and you're walking toward the court building, or you find each other at the steps of the court. Jesus is basically saying, look, you understand this from everyday life. Until you get in front of the judge, it's easier and better to settle this. Why? Because you have no idea what's going to happen once you enter a courtroom. I'm as guilty as anyone. We have a fantasy as Americans, and I'm as guilty as anybody. We have a fantasy that if you are in the right and you go to court, that you'll be vindicated and found not guilty because you didn't do anything wrong, and you know this and you can prove it. We can all think of, and again, I'm not being political. Think throughout history. How many court cases have you known where somebody didn't get what they deserve or got something they didn't deserve? The evidence is maybe overwhelming, but the reality is, and lawyers will be the first one to tell you this, once you enter the courtroom, you are at the mercy of the judge or 12 random people that have no personal interest in your life. And actually, it's the ideal when they have no personal interest, because maybe they have a vendetta. Jesus is using this because they understood this in an everyday life situation. Until you are in front of the judge, you can figure out a way to work it out. But once you're in the courtroom, guess what? They own you. You are at the mercy of the court. Yes, technically, it's possible to settle things, but most of the time, once you get into court, any settlement that's going to happen is not really going to be beneficial. How many times have somebody been pled or been forced to plead guilty to something because they're afraid of a greater punishment, even though they're demanding that they're innocent, and even sometimes later proven that they were innocent? Well, why did you plead guilty? Well, he said it was the death penalty or life in prison or 5 years of parole. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Now, ultimately, he's talking about our relationship with each other and ultimately our relationship with God, but he's using the analogy of a legal system that his hearers would have been very familiar with. And this is one of those instances where we don't have to do a lot of digging. What was court like back in the day? Pretty much exactly what we have today. I mean, different culture, sure. But the system itself, our system, is based largely on Roman law. So we don't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to understand it. It's almost as if God planned the writing of his word during this time and for us to be here benefiting from it. So the message is that once judgment is pronounced, that's it. Reconcile before you get into court. Ultimately, in this passage, what court? God's court, the ultimate judge. Now, let's put some feet to this. Should you interpret this passage literally? I think so. I think it's clear that this is a literal, if you are here trying to worship God and you remember that there is a problem, you need to make that right beforehand. Think about it. What is better, to maybe offend someone that you walked out of a building or didn't follow some protocol so that you could reconcile with someone before God, or to honor people's wishes for you to sit still and be quiet and dishonor God's word? See, we get so wrapped up in our culture and our way of doing things, our tradition. I mean, think about it. Think about it this way. I don't even know who the deacon on call is this week, but whoever they are, I'm going to pick on you. Let's say whoever the deacon on call is today comes to the church to open up and then realizes, oh, there's somebody I need to reconcile with. Guys, I opened all the doors, but I'm not going to be there today. I've got to drive an hour away to deal with something. I imagine there would be a lot of negative talk. But I would say, based on this passage, that would be a godly thing to do. we need to make sure that we're honoring God's word above all. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. But let's go a little further. We have, from last week, the responsibility. We understand the church side of it, if something needs to be elevated to official church discipline. We talked about that last week. Last week, we also talked about what do you do when you messed up. This week, we're talking about what do you do if someone is offended at you. Notice, we still haven't said whether that person is right or wrong. It's just the fact that they're offended. Do you see anywhere in this passage where that matters? No. Why? Why doesn't it matter? Because we're called to unity. We're called to build each other up. We're called to glorify God in our relationships and represent His kingdom in the way that we work. So it's not about who's right and wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we don't discuss that. But it's not about who's right and wrong. It's, I know that person's bothered by something I did. I don't know whether I really did it or not. Or maybe you already know. Well, I did this. They totally misunderstood it. Or they're just the type of person that's just angry at everybody. It doesn't matter, according to this passage. You still need to go and deal with it the best that you can. That's why that Romans 12, was it 18, I think? Romans 12:18. That's why that passage is so important and so powerful. I can't control other people's perceptions. One of my pastors, he didn't create it, but he was famous for saying it. He always said, perception is reality. In the most technical sense, he's wrong, but in the sense that people's perception is what they count on to determine their reality, he's right. I can't control another person's perception. But if I know that someone is offended at me and I have the opportunity to go and speak with them and say, hey, I know something's bothering you, or maybe you know exactly what it is. Hey, look, I know this happened. Let's talk about it. I wasn't trying to offend you, or hey, I messed up. It's your job to go to that person and do your best to have a godly conversation about it for the sake of reconciliation. How they respond then is between them and God. If you go, let's say you did something wrong, you go to them and you say, look, brother, sister, I messed up. I did X, Y, and Z. I shouldn't have. I should have done this instead. I'm sorry, and I would appreciate if you forgave me. And the other person goes, no, I'm not forgiving you. How dare you? And whatever. You've done your part. You've honored God by going to that person and trying to reconcile. And now the other person is going to have to deal with God for their unforgiveness. And sometimes it takes us time. We're human. God understands that our emotions don't get in check right away. That's not the problem. The problem is if we're unwilling. On the other hand, somebody's offended, and let's say you're 100% sure you didn't do anything wrong, but this other person is offended. If you know about it, according to this passage, you're still responsible to go to that person and say, look, I understand you're upset. Can we talk about this? Can you explain to me what you're upset about and why? And then this is just my advice to you. I don't have a specific passage to point to, but my advice would be close the mouth and just listen for a little while. I've found oftentimes people just want to vent, even if they're in the right, but especially when they're perceiving something that may not be real. And here's the thing. When you're talking about two imperfect people perceiving a situation, neither of you are ever going to have exactly the same understanding of that situation. But let them vent. Let them just get it out. Because so often we bottle things up inside like a soda that's been shaken. How many of you want me to shake up a soda and then hand it to you? In fact, if you didn't know this, Ace is no longer shaking paint cans that are not either new or nearly new. Because somebody messed up. They had one explode a while back. So they're not doing that anymore. some people, I would argue probably most people, tend to bottle things up. And if you open soda slowly, it's less likely to explode than if you just take the cap off all at once. If you never open it, then your entire life is in turmoil. So when you go to that person, right or wrong, let them vent for a minute. And while they're venting, try not to take offense at what they're saying. Now, I'm not saying you have to accept what they're saying. I'm saying try not to take offense. Because most people speak very strongly when they're upset. So hear them out. In your mind, try and understand, what is it that they are communicating? What is it that I think they're trying to communicate? And what's really behind this? Counseling 101, if you ever go through any form of a counseling program, one of the first things that you will learn is that the presenting problem is rarely, if ever, the real problem. Well, that person did this and that. So, I don't know, let's take the classic marriage example of the toothpaste. One person squeezes it from the bottom, and one person is the monster that squeezes it from the middle. And they end up in counseling over this and how the bag of chips was done and which way the toilet paper was done. By the way, the patent was found on that. There is a right way to do it. But are those really the problems? Or is it that we feel disrespected and that's a symptom of the problem? Or we're inconvenienced and our kingdom isn't the way we want it, and that's a symptom of the problem? See, those are symptoms. Those aren't the real problems. They're symptoms of the problem. So when you're listening to someone, try and listen for what's going on behind it. What's the real heart issue here? Because we can deal with behavior all day, but if we never get to the heart issue, we will never solve the problem. So whether the person is right or wrong, I started this analogy with the other person is perceiving incorrectly, it's still my responsibility to go to them and hear them out. And then you can lovingly say, okay, I hear you. Good counseling advice, good life advice. What I hear you saying is, and then summarize. If you get in the habit of doing that, you will be amazed how often the person's like, that's not at all what I was saying. Okay, let's back up and try again. What I hear you saying is, oh, that's closer. And again, what I've found is oftentimes when you have this conversation, and especially if both sides are listening, you can fix heart problems, and then the behaviors take care of themselves. So there's a little counseling advice for you in there, and just general rubber meets the road, how do I live some of this out? But the bottom line is that we're called to unity. And as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. If you've done something wrong, own it and confess it. If somebody has done something wrong to you, go to them and say, hey, this bothered me, in love. If somebody's offended at you and you know it and you don't have a clue what's going on, or maybe you do, it's still your responsibility to go to that person in love, as best you can in humility, and try and seek reconciliation. The other thing that I want to say, though, and I referenced it a minute ago, don't expect that the warm fuzzies are going to be there immediately. We can forgive someone in the sense of, okay, God, that's, kind of like parents, that's your child, right? We can turn them over to God. Okay, God, I'm going to choose not to hold it against that person anymore. But our emotions still feel emotional. We need to try our best to submit our emotions to God, and through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, through maturity, it comes easier and quicker. But we are human, and God understands that, and sometimes it takes time to check your emotions with what you know to do that is right. That's okay as long as you're working on it. And then the other qualifier I will give is, this is often asked, is there ever a time in the modern way of saying it, is there ever a time to cancel someone or cut them out of your life? I would say two things to that. The first is maybe. But actually the first should be no unless. And let me qualify. In general, we are called to reconcile. We're called to do our best to restore relationships. So, in as much as we can, we do that. The qualifier that I would give is that I think, based on biblical wisdom, I cannot point to a specific verse. Plenty of good Bible teachers would disagree with me. But I think that if there is still an active sin, a rebellious active sin, I don't think that we're called to fellowship. I think that's the Matthew 18 passage, where if there is continued rebellious sin, then it is appropriate to treat that person as a Gentile. One of my good friends is lost, but I don't confess things to him the way that I do my brothers and sisters in Christ that I'm close with. There's a difference in relationship, even though I would argue he's one of my better friends. But I'll give you guys an example. Some of you, I've talked about it more in the past than I have recently, but my dad was very abusive. I'm more than willing to talk about that at any point in time, but for today, that's all you need to know, is that he was very abusive. If my dad ever truly repented, like genuinely repented of what he did, I have long since forgiven him on my part. I had to turn it over to God, because remember what I shared last week? An American proverb, bitterness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Right? I have to have a clear relationship with God. I can't control him. So I forgave him a long time ago, but he's never asked for my forgiveness directly. I would grant him that. If he asked, Aaron, please forgive me, I'd say, not only do I, but I did a long time ago. You still got to deal with God. And I don't mean that in a mean way, in a factual way. But there is still zero chance that I would leave him alone with my children because of the things that he's done. Zero chance. And maybe that's unforgiveness in my heart that I'm not aware of. But I think the Bible calls me as a man to protect my family. And I think that it would be unwise to allow him access, especially unfettered access, to my children, because I have a responsibility to them to protect them. So, while I would be open to a relationship if he was genuinely repentant, it would not be a typical grandparent relationship, because there are consequences, there are earthly consequences to our actions. So I hope that helps you sort through, how do I accomplish what we're taught in these passages, and what does that look like in everyday life? I hope that helps. Please, if the church at large, our church too, but the church at large, all churches, if churches would get this, most of the problems would just go away. But since we don't, they persist. But I want you in your life to be able to practice these things. Because let me share with you, there's a group called Peacemakers. Sandy is the last name. If you get a hold of one of their books, they're pretty good. It's been a long time since I've read them, so maybe there's some little something I don't remember that I might not agree with. But if you develop the habit of being a peacemaker, it's almost like Jesus said something about blessed are the peacemakers. If you develop a habit of being a peacemaker, your life will be exponentially free afterward compared to before. We weigh ourselves down so much, worrying about something that is ultimately God's responsibility, or holding on to anger and bitterness and pain. And if we would just turn over to God the results and do our best, just like the Romans passage and last week's sermon and this one, to live in a spirit of forgiveness, recognizing we've sinned too, our lives would be drastically different. We wouldn't have nearly the anxiety and the turmoil and the problems that we do. Problems will still exist. We live in a broken world. But so many of those things would go away. Think about how much energy, and I'm the first to admit it, think about how much energy and time, the imaginary conversations, the rage rant that you do in private or in the car when you think nobody's there, and think about all the energy and time that we spent being angry. And instead, if we had spent that growing closer to the Lord, instead of angry at His children, what a difference that would make.